VLS is on, right? Go ahead, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Denise, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to House Economic Matters Committee. Today is Tuesday, January 26th. This morning, we will have a fiscal briefing from the Department of Legislative Services. We have Mr. Romans and Ms. Zimmerman here to brief us this morning, so we will let them get through their brief, and then we can take questions. And similar to previous meetings, I'll take them in the order that the hands go up. Just a reminder, if you could all update your names. It looks like all the delegates are good. But if you have a question, if you could just make sure that the name is updated, as well as when you ask a question, your camera is on. So with that, we'll get started. Mr. Romans and Ms. Zimmerman, thank you so much for coming today, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. We're going to share a document on the screen, I believe, that gives you kind of the overview of the budget. It's a rather lengthy document, but we're just going to hit the highlights, just the first few pages of the document, and then we'll be happy at the end to answer any questions committee members have. In the big picture, this is the best of times for the state budget and state finances. Before the governor submitted his budget proposal, we entered the current year.
All right.
Hold on one second, sir. Hey, thank you. Go ahead.
We entered the session with a surplus in the current year of about $4 billion, which is an extraordinary level. And that's because the economy has performed much better than expected, both in the year that we ended, fiscal 21, and then in the current year, revenue estimates have been increased substantially, and they were increased in December again for the fiscal 23, the upcoming budget. So the top of that chart on the page shows you the overall budget growth. For fiscal 23, the governor proposes $58 billion of spending, about $25.7 billion is general funds. Now, overall, the budget drops, as you can see, about $3.6 billion or 6%. The reason for that is that last year's budget included a lot of federal stimulus money from the various congressional actions, as well as quite a bit of enhanced entitlement money in Medicaid. The federal government has enhanced the state match temporarily, and the SNAP program has seen much greater demand and some federal enhancements as well. So there's a lot of temporary federal spending in fiscal 22 that starts to dissipate in fiscal 23. And you can see federal funds actually drop $7.7 billion. The interesting part is the general funds, which are growing $4.6 billion under the governor's plan, 22% growth in general fund spending. Now, in fairness, $2.4 billion of that is going into the rainy day fund. So he's appropriating money into a savings account. So the budget growth, when you kind of discard that, is about 13%. So still a rather extremely high compared to recent years general fund growth, reflecting the fact that we have all of this cash available. A couple of things to note. The governor, as I mentioned, appropriated a large amount to the rainy day fund. So under his plan, the rainy day fund will close fiscal 23 with $3.6 billion in the bank. That's 16% of general fund revenues. In addition, there's a general fund balance at the end of 23 of about $600 million. So all told, about $4.2 billion in cash remaining in reserves. One other note on federal funds is just that the federal infrastructure legislation that was passed a few months back, none of that money that will come into Maryland is reflected in the budget at this point. Part of that is just simply because the bill was passed, late in the fall, and a lot of the guidance from federal agencies and even the precise amounts that Maryland will get are not yet available. So the budget does not reflect any of that money. We can go to the next page. So one of the key elements of the governor's plan is tax relief proposals. There's three components of that. The first is phasing out income tax and retirement income. You would phase it out across fiscal 23 through fiscal 28. The revenue loss in 23 is $188 million. It grows by the governor's estimates to $730 million in fiscal 27. We have not yet seen an estimate for fiscal 28, though when we do the fiscal note, we can certainly produce that. It'll be more than 730. Second piece is he's waiving business filing fees for people who file online beginning in fiscal 23. And you can see the revenue losses from that are 36 million the first year, grows to almost 50 million by 27. And the third piece is last year in the Relief Act, the General Assembly expanded the earned income tax credit and made some enhancements to the benefits. And that was done for 3 tax years 20 through 22. The governor is proposing to extend that permanently. No fiscal impact in 23 as it was already in effect for 23, but it'll cost us about 160 million a year beginning in fiscal 24. So overall revenue losses by fiscal 27 of over $900 million. Now let's go to the next slide. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is the structural budget outlook. So this is ongoing revenues versus ongoing spending. There's a lot of things going on in the chart. The solid black line shows you the governor's forecast before his tax relief. You see substantial surpluses expected. And then the blue bars below show you the surplus after accounting for the tax relief. And you can see, again, under the governor's accounting, still 200 to 300 million a year in most years of structural surplus. Legislative Services thinks that the forecast understates K through 12 education, particularly in the out years. As you can see, by fiscal 27, we think there would actually be a structural deficit of about 409 million, that gray bar, if you take into account the governor's tax relief and properly fund K through 12 education. So while the governor's proposals are certainly affordable in the near term, by 27, and it starts looking like it's going to be challenging. And it likely will be worse if we extend this out to fiscal 28 because the tax relief is not all fully phased in until 28. And one of the things that drives general fund costs up in fiscal 28 is that there will need to be some general funds to help support implementation of the Kerwin legislation that in the initial years is funded with dedicated special funds in the Blueprint Fund. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tanya Zimmerman, who's going to walk you through the rest of our presentation.
Thank you. So if you turn to the next page, this first item kind of describes how the surplus was allocated that was mentioned previously. A good portion of that, 2.4 billion, is related to the deposit into the rainy day fund. It also leaves a general fund balance of over $300 million in addition to those savings. In addition, there are adjustments to the fiscal 2022 spending that also would reduce use the surplus, and that includes employee compensation and cybersecurity, as well as funding for child care provider stabilization and health insurance costs being the largest component. There is also additional kind of one-time spending in fiscal 2023 related to unfunded liabilities, program open space repayment, and food banks. And there's also kind of most significantly, there's over 900 million in PAYGO in fiscal 2023. So other key features of the budget include spending related to K-12 education, which increases by over 260 million. However, there is not funding provided for the education effort adjustment component of Kerwin, which would have provided funding to Baltimore City and Prince George's County. The fiscal 2023 budget includes funding for rate increases for most healthcare providers. The rate increases vary, but they range between 3.25% and 4%. There's also an increase of about 100 million in funding for crime prevention and victim services. The largest component of that increase is funding for police aid, which increases by 48 million. There's also significant increases for victim services providers and a variety of other areas. The budget also provides an additional 60 million in state funding to assist child care providers and support costs related to the child care scholarship program. There's also $110 million to address cybersecurity issues and state government. Go to the next page. The budget also accounts for a 2% increase in tuition at the University System of Maryland. The state operating support of the university system increases by nearly $300 million with increases at Morgan State of about 33 million and St. Mary's College of about 1.8 million. Due to the increases at those public four-year institutions, the funding increases for both the community college formula aid and aid to the non-public higher education institutions fairly significantly. So over 59 million for the community colleges and nearly 30 million for the non-public higher education institutions. There's also significant funding for enhancements to state employee compensation in both fiscal 2022 and 2023. Those include cost of living adjustments, bonuses for certain employees, and salary increments. The actual enhancements vary by bargaining unit. There's significant capital spending of $1.17 billion. In general obligation bonds, that's supplemented by additional general fund pay-go spending and spending in bond premiums. Beginning at the bottom of that page, there's a discussion of some of the issues that will require some kind of consideration related to the budget, and that includes the tax proposals that the governor has provided. What the appropriate level of cash reserves are. The governor's budget provides a rainy day fund balance of well in excess of what the Spending Affordability Committee's target of 9% of general fund revenues was. And also related to that, kind of developing clear criteria for withdrawing funds from the rainy day fund. You go to the next page. As was noted, the budget does not include funding for the education effort adjustment. There's also a number of smaller programs that were contained within Kerwin that are not funded. Those smaller programs were not mandated funding, but that's a total is about $140 million. As was noted earlier, there's not funding related to the federal infrastructure legislation in the allowance. And so some consideration may want to be given about how that funding would be spent. In addition, there is funding for kind of legislative priorities within the capital budget, but it is less than what the Spending Affordability Committee had targeted at the level. The long-term sustainability of the Blueprint Fund, well, DLS projects that the Blueprint Fund can fully support Kerwin implementation through fiscal 2025. General funds are expected to be needed beginning in fiscal 2026. The federal government recently extended the national public health emergency, and with that extension, there will be an additional 3 months of the enhanced Medicaid match, which would free up over $100 million of general funds, which would be available to be repurposed. And finally is related to state hiring and retention, which continues to be challenging across state agencies. And while there is significant funding for salary increases and bonuses, there could be opportunities for additional strategies to address those challenges. And that's all we have for you, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you to the members. Does anybody have any questions? Delegate Chi.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, and thank you for the great briefing. My question is related to the waiving of online business filing fee. Do you know what percentage, and it shows, let me see, I took a cell phone image of that. So in 2023, the estimated revenue loss will be 36 million, and up to 2027, it will be 48 million. Do you know what percentage of the projected revenue that would be?
And by fiscal 27, it's more than half. I want to say that the projected revenue is in the like 75 to $80 million range. And so you can see it's a substantial portion of it.
So majority of the revenue.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Delegate Aaron's.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. David, just a real fast one. You had a slide up there about the structural budget, and you mentioned that you disagreed with the governor's projection. And I think 2026 was 368 million, and then you all had it at in 2027 at negative 409. Could you elaborate on that? How do we get from one to the other? That's a big delta.
Hey, real quick, can you reshare that slide so everybody can be honed in on what Delegate Aaron's is asking? Because I think it's a good question.
Sure.
I think it was the last slide David briefed.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, if you could mark that down that I had a good question, I appreciate it. Just
It's noted for the record. We'll journalize it.
well, I thank you so much.
So, I mean, for the most part, we thought the governor's estimates and the forecast, taking a quick look, we only had a few days to look at it, were reasonable. What we found, though, is that the K through 12 education estimate of spending is just much lower than the forecast the Legislative Services has done. And to be honest, we've asked the Department of Budget and Management to share their assumptions so we could better understand why we were so different, and they rejected our request to share the information. So we are unable to tell you why we're different, but we've run our numbers with a few different enrollment scenarios because we thought that was the most likely driver, and we're comfortable that any reasonable enrollment projection is going to be result in a much higher spending level than the governor proposed.
Okay, but even by your own numbers, you have in 2026 368, and then the very next year you go down to 409. You did. I mean, he has it at 324, and he keeps it at 248. But you all, I mean, what is causing that in 1 year?
Gotcha. So what happens is that they only prepared a general fund estimate. So they gave us a K through 12 general fund number, and that number gets supplemented per law with money from the Blueprint Fund. So in the early years, we have a huge cash balance right now in the Blueprint Fund. It was built up to help, phase in the program. And so that carries us through fiscal 26 without needing general funds above what the administration estimated. But by fiscal 27, we've run out of all that fund balance that we've been kind of living off of. And we suddenly don't have enough money in the Blueprint Fund to cover all of the Kerwin costs. And so that's what happens is that the Blueprint money kind of hides the problem for a few years, but then when it's exhausted, the general fund suddenly has to pick up a lot of K through 12 costs.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Branch.
Yeah, thank you. Dave, I was just listening to you. Since it was the Blueprint was underfunded in the way that it has been underfunded, what suggestions do you have for, and given what you just mentioned to Delegate Aaron's, what are your suggestions for making sure we're able to bring the Blueprint up to level that was projected?
Right. So in the current year, it's about 126 million short of the mandates. The first issue is the Attorney General's office is looking at whether it is a mandate. Because the administration is claiming that for fiscal 23, the Education Effort Index is not a mandate. They're going to try to get that resolved in the next week or two. If they conclude it's a mandate, which I think they will, I think that then the question is, will the governor put in a supplemental budget to add the money to appropriately fund the mandates? There's nothing that forces him to do that, even though it is a mandate. So I think otherwise the General Assembly will either have to negotiate with him or try to fence some money somewhere else in the budget and say you should use this money to fund the mandate.
Thanks.
Delegate Brooks.
Thanks, Mr. Vice Chair. Yeah, David, on that last, probably second to the last slide, you said the long-term sustainability of the Blueprint Fund, DLS projects that the Blueprint Fund could fully support implementations of the current education enhancement through fiscal 2025, but beginning in fiscal 2026, the general fund supplement may prove necessary. Now, does the fact that the TCJA, the Tax Cut Jobs Act, will be sunsetting that year, does that have any impact at all on what you're stating here? Because that seems like that windfall, that surplus is going to evaporate at that point.
It really isn't related to that. I mean, what happened is the state's made a great deal of effort, the General Assembly has, to put away money to help pay for the blueprint. So we have a large amount of money in a special fund balance. And that is really helpful to covering all the costs these first few years of implementation. But the blueprint is phased in over many years up through 2034. So the costs keep going up by multiple hundreds of millions each year. And eventually we spend down that fund balance, and the new revenues going to the blueprint fund just aren't enough to keep up with the projected expenditures. So that's when general funds start needing to supplement the blueprint fund.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands. So with that, this concludes this morning's briefings. We will be back at 1 p.m. for 2 bill hearings, and there are 11 individuals signed up total for both those hearings for oral testimony. So thank you, everybody. And